Lady Wormwood by Marc. We open with a quote from the ancient Hebrew book of Enoch. "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants." I used to be happy when I was a child, and then my imagination was taken away. It was a freak accident, an act of God, they called it. I was playing in my driveway, going round and round on my plastic tricycle one partly cloudy with occasional showers afternoon, making up a story about a friendly dragon that rescued an invisible island continent from the oppression of an evil and angry babysitter. My mother lay sleeping on the couch, hugging a bottle, while Walter Cronkite spewed forth the latest on how the United States was not dropping bombs in Cambodia. I don't remember much of it at all. I do remember that the dragon and the babysitter had prevailed upon my musings for days prior. The neighbor lady, Mrs. O'Reilly, said that she had heard a loud boom and saw a bright flash, or saw a bright flash and heard a loud boom. She never was absolutely certain which came first, which was no surprise. She and my mother had shared their bottles more than a few times. And the next thing she knew, I was laying on my driveway, quivering. Smoke drifted out of my head and up into the gray skies. My plastic tricycle had melted. The doctors were fascinated with my case. A lightning bolt had apparently entered the right side of my head just behind my ear and exited through my right eye. That's why I wear the patch. I opted for the patch instead of the glass eye later when I was in high school because it was so cool, so Dr. Hook. I suffered no permanent ill effects other than the loss of my right eye and all of my hair. And of course there was the portion of the right side of my brain that became inactive, the side that held my imagination. So I lost my imagination, or rather, it was taken from me. So I grew up and became an absinthe dealer with no imagination. And what's funny is the fact that all of my clients made their living using theirs. Something Freudian in that, no doubt. Now, the type of absinthe I dealt was the real absinthe from Europe, banned in the United States by the FDA, something about toxins, dementia, and liver failure. My clients were the artists of LA, writers, painters, actors, directors, and other miscellaneous people of the arts. They said it enhanced their work. I think my favorite client was this writer named Marc. I'm using him now. I said earlier that I was happy when I was a child. My adult life, I lived in hopelessness and despair. I endured in the misery of knowing that I could never resurrect my imagination from the state of eternal death to which it had been damned by the gods who so quickly and painfully snatched it from me when I was just a youngster. And then there was Lady Artemisia. Now, I sold two kinds of absinthe. Spanish Bohemian, which you can procure for $150 per 12-ounce bottle. Now, I acquired that stuff from a guy named Ruiz in the south of Spain. He's a strange cat, but honest. It's good shit. And Danish Gold Label, which was my mainstay. Now, you can get the Danish absinthe for $550 per 12-ounce bottle, and it's the best there is. I secured my Danish spirits from Lady Artemisia. Now, I hadn't taken a vacation in years, so when I received an invitation to visit Denmark and the absinthe distillery owned by Lady Artemisia for the unveiling of her new product, Danish Gold Label number 62, touted as the best ever, and a tour of their Wormwood fields, I was obliged to accept. In this business, the contacts are few and far between, and you try to keep your main suppliers happy. Besides, I needed the holiday. I also had never met the woman who was pretty much responsible for supplying me with 75% of my product and a tax-free 6-figure annual gross income. So I packed some socks, underwear, and silk pajamas, along with an extra suit and a copy of The Catcher in the Rye because I needed something to read, and flew out to Denmark. I arrived in Copenhagen at midnight in the rain and immediately transferred to my charter plane, a twin-engine Cessna. Of all the planes and all the airport hangars in all the world, I had to draw the twin-engine Cessna. People were always crashing twin-engine Cessnas. I must have read about a twin-engine Cessna wreck every week in my local paper and had decided long, long ago that I would never fly in one. But at midnight in Copenhagen, in the pouring rain, jet-lagged and wanting my journey, which took me from LAX to Dallas to LaGuardia to London to Copenhagen, all in a grueling 38 hours. I wanted it to finally come to an end. I stuffed my fear of twin-engine Cessnas into a bottle and drank it. It was dark, it was rainy, my pilot looked like he hadn't slept in 4 days, and he smelled like he hadn't bathed in twice that period. The flight was the worst hour of my life. Later, when I was safely back in the States, I joked about the ordeal, calling it the $200 roller coaster ride. We slammed down several times while attempting to land on the tiny airstrip, which was only a few minutes from the absinthe distillery and Wormwood fields near a remote village called Baldork, which was a few miles southeast of the town of Silkeborg, which was nestled in the hills of Jutland. I honestly thought that we were crashing and that I was going to die, and I screamed like a toddler locked in a closet. But screams and all, we had safely landed in Baldork. At least the devil that was laughing at me from the pilot's seat said that we had landed in Baldork. There were no signs from the Rotary Club saying, "Welcome to Baldork, enjoy your stay." No big lighted letters that read Baldork International Mud Strip, or even a road marker for that matter. I honestly couldn't tell you if they flew me to Mexico or Disneyland or Tora Bora. I just had to trust that I was taken to my planned destination, Baldork. I was transported via pickup truck down a bumpy, muddy road, the pilot's jollity still ringing in my ears. The rain had finally stopped, and the moon was attempting to peek out from behind its mother's skirt in the form of some dissipating thunderheads. I rolled my window down and inhaled deeply. Now, this made my driver nervous, and he began making gestures for me to roll it up and fearfully babbling on in some language, Danish more than likely. I sped out the window and rolled it up very slowly. I was not enjoying the travel personnel of Denmark. We pulled into a well-lit driveway, and I saw the only sign that I would see this side of the Kattegat Strait. It read Lady Artemisia. I stepped out into a stunning courtyard of marble fountains and thick ferns. Triple-bulb gas lamps lined the cobblestone walkways. The main building looked like a hybrid mansion of a traditional cedar cabin, all logs and glass and chandelier lighting, and it made those cedar homes in the glossy catalogs look like trailer park trash. I was taken to my own little bungalow out behind the main building. Now, there must have been 20 or 30 of these single-room miniature log cabins situated in a semicircle. There was soft orange light spilling out from some of the cottage windows while others remained dark. I fell into my double bed and drifted off to sleep, grateful that I had survived the trek. At least I didn't have to worry about having any nightmares regarding my Cessna flight. I hadn't had a dream since the day I was struck by lightning. The next morning, I was visited by a very fastidious British houseman, dressed in a $1,000 tux, who looked like he should be named Jeeves. His gold-plated name tag read Personal Assistant Reginald, but he looked like a Jeeves. He brought my breakfast and coldly informed me that I was to remain in my room all day. There was a television and a VCR with a small library of movies to select from, mostly big Hollywood films of the 80s and a few Danish porn flicks. I chose to keep the TV off and caught up on my sleep. Catcher in the Rye sat at the bottom of my suitcase. I must have missed lunch because I awoke in the late afternoon to a ringing telephone. I answered on the 12th ring because I couldn't find the damned thing. It was hidden in a drawer beside the bed. I was told that dinner would be brought to my room at 7, and I was to meet with all the other guests in the main tasting room, which was in the central building, promptly at 8. My food arrived at 7 sharp, and I pushed the green stuff around the brown stuff and wondered what the hell the blue stuff was supposed to be. And at 5 minutes of 8, I left my cabin. We assembled in the main tasting chamber, which was a vaulted ceiling cathedral of a room. Giant log beams crisscrossed high over our heads, and thick black chains hung down, holding enormous wrought iron candle chandeliers. There was one long mahogany table running down the center of the rectangular and cedar-paneled hall, and attendants dressed in those $1,000 tuxedos lined the walls behind our chairs. Over their motionless heads were Picassos and Monets, Van Goghs and Rembrandts, and a few artists that I did not recognize. I didn't see Jeeves until it dawned on me to look over my shoulder. He was there, nose up, hands at his sides, and he never acknowledged me. They obviously didn't rely on tips. When we were all seated, I quickly counted 20 of us, 10 down each row with the head chair empty. A door off to the side of the room whooshed open, and 2 men dressed in camouflage fatigues and black ski masks entered, brandishing some type of automatic rifles. At least I assumed they were automatic weapons. I'm no gun dealer, but I've seen enough film of angry Middle Easterners on the 6 o'clock news to know what those wooden-stocked rifles with the long clips were. The 2 flanked the door, and from between them she entered, covered from head to foot in flowing, rust-colored silk robes. Her face was half hidden behind a veil. One could only see her eyes, an incandescent gold, which seemed to glow and pulsate with her heartbeat. The fancy contact lenses of a wealthy absinthe brewer, no doubt. She drifted to the head of the table, and the 2 guards followed. When she sat, they stood on either side of her chair. The gunmen kept looking at each one of us, constantly moving their masked heads in tiny, almost imperceptible jerks, the way flies do. Intimidation was definitely their forte, and I wondered what they were thinking when they stared at me. Before each of us sat an empty crystal snifter, and immediately after she was seated, the men in tuxes filled them halfway with the green nectar billed as Danish gold label number 62. We were each handed slotted spoons brimming with raw sugar, and as we held them over our snifters, the waiters poured iced water over the spoons. The sugar water leaked into our glasses, and the green fluid slowly morphed into a milky avocado, flecked with a dozen swirling and sparkling colors, the trademark look of good absinthe. Then we drank. It was the best damn merchandise I had ever tasted. After that, things waxed a little fuzzy around the edges, which is one of the reasons why I never used my product. I recall being escorted back to my room and sent gently down on my bed. I thanked Reginald, calling him Jeeves, I think, and instantly fell asleep, I think. Now, this is a very big I think, and also where it became particularly obscure and kind of woolly. While I slept, I had a dream, or so I thought. I thought I slept, or I thought I dreamed, for the first time in over 30 years. In my dream, there were 2 short raps on my door, and then it burst open. The 2 masked gunmen that had been in the tasting room earlier were now standing inside my doorway, and one of them announced, "Lady Artemisia," in an unmistakably Brooklyn accent. I was positive that it was Brooklyn. I love New York and visit there quite often. And some of my best friends are from Brooklyn. And then she walked in. She had shed her robes. Her head was shaved. She had no hair upon her body whatsoever, just thin, dark eyebrows and long amber eyelashes. Her golden eyes pulsed and swirled and turned from saffron to mustard to shining brass. And she was tattooed from head to foot. Her entire body was covered in mosaic designs of brown, green, red, black, and blue inks of varying shades and blends. I had only seen people decorated like this in pictures. A National Geographic article, perhaps. The Illustrated Man comes to mind, but it zipped across my mind as the Illustrated Woman. At first I thought it was a body stocking of some sort. Sheer silk, perhaps, but sweat glistened in the glow emanating from the candle that burned above my headboard, and I knew it was all skin and ink. It ran up and around her neck and covered her head completely. Her golden eyes blazed. It was surreal. She was beautiful. She walked over to me, and I must admit I was aroused. She slipped her hand down into mine and helped me to my feet. Her full lips were the color of red maple leaves in October. "Come, I will show you my new wormwood field," she said, in some thick Slavic accent. So I went with. We walked along a dirt pathway, and she instructed me to walk behind her, and kept several paces ahead of me. I could hear her 2 mercenaries directly behind us. The moon was out, and it was hot. I had never felt a night so hot in all my life. Now, it might have been the drink, or it might have been the dream. I'll never know. I had certainly never expected a climate like this in northwestern Europe. And we walked through tall trees and over a footbridge that spanned a narrow brook, which actually babbled. I giggled at the phrase babbling brook that ran through my head over and over. I could not take my eyes off of her. She moved with purpose and authority. This was her place, her domain. Lady Artemisia, Lady Wormwood. As we made our way through the small forest, I became aware of a distant ringing in my ears that grew louder with each passing moment. It sounded like a field of dry grass, full of cicadas on a sweltering summer day, a high-pitched buzz. The air became increasingly viscous, filling with a musky odor mixed with some type of floral aroma. Roses, perhaps? The atmosphere seemed charged with electricity, and suddenly I knew that someone was in the bushes next to me, staring at me. I quickly turned my head and peered into the brush. I saw nothing, only darkness with patches of moonlight illuminating tree trunks and leaves here and there. And so I continued on, following my mysterious hostess deeper into the woods. But the electricity in the air grew heavier, as did the pungent fragrance and the feeling of being watched. And so again I glanced into the undergrowth. And I saw him. Now, he was moving parallel to me and keeping pace, but neither did twigs snap nor did branches waver as he drifted along beside me. It was as if he were gliding slightly above the ground and through the forest. Now, he was a very tall man, well over 7 feet, perhaps taller, and he was glowing. Not emanating light in the sense that fireflies flicker or the hands on a diver's watch radiate, yet it was as if, instead of existing as a glowing creature, he was an entity of light. He did not illuminate his immediate surroundings, but rather his brilliance was absorbed by the darkness around him, making him all the more intense. His skin was the color of morning fog, and his long, curly hair and thick, flowing beard were as red as I had ever seen. He was dressed in a simple white robe, and in one of his large hands was a staff, as long as he. Then there were his eyes. His eyes were golden sparks, and they did emanate light. And they were locked on mine, and he seemed to be reaching into my psyche, feeling around the corridors of my soul like tendrils of supernatural intelligence, seeking out territory to be inhabited. I felt invaded. Suddenly, I met with a burst of fresh air. We were out of the trees and walking amidst the Wormwood fields. I can no more describe to you what those fields looked like in that azure haze of pale moonlight than I can describe the mosaic on that woman's body, only that they were beautiful. A maze of complicated and interwoven paths that had purpose. The word purpose flashed into my mind's eye over and over. I was baffled at the word purpose. I kept walking, but my head turned and my gaze was kept locked on the strange man. But he had stopped at the forest's edge, not venturing out. And, as if he understood my puzzlement at the word purpose, which kept flashing in my head, I heard a clicking sound, which, ask me not how I knew this, I just did, came from him. And I felt a door open inside of my intuition. And it was revealed to me. Each leaf on each branch of each plant was an individual entity with a unique design and specific destiny. The multitude of tiny silver hairs that lined each wormwood leaf glistened in the moonlight, singing out a lunar tune perceptible only as a more faint version of that buzzing in my ears. And they were waving like cilia, yet with no breeze to stir them to movement, each with its own design, each with its own kismet. Every root follicle, every shoot, every node, and every flower bud had a singular and specific purpose, a preordained destiny. These were the true fields of Wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, not a nuisance weed as they were known in many parts of the world, not another cash crop as a select few figured them here in Europe, not a bunch of plants, not a patch of grasses, but a field of hundreds of thousands of tiny individuals with one single purpose, with 100,000 different purposes, and one ruler. I glanced over beside the tall, glowing man and saw the 2 triggermen lingering at the edge of the forest, not 10 feet away from the giant. They did not enter the fields as Lady Artemisia and I did, and they seemed to be unaware of the presence of the tall man. The angel, my mind whispered. I suppose it could have been an angel. I suppose I could have been hallucinating. I suppose that this could all have happened in my imagination as I lay dreaming in my cabin. Nevertheless, whether in dream or in reality, I watched him. He lingered on the fringe. I was able to gaze at this magnificent creature for quite some time. All the while, his golden, glowing eyes never left me. I could still feel him scanning and exploring my mind. And then he turned, disappearing back into the brush. Then Lady Artemisia took my hand, and we strolled along the paths that wound their way around and through the knee-high fields of brushy flowers. She would point here and there and explain that this field was a different variety of Artemisia absinthium than that one, but that they were all some sort of wormwood. The silver follicles waved in the moonlight. The humming buzz pierced my heart and entered to the very core of my lifeblood. She said that her father had taught her all. She began explaining to me the brain's capability of manufacturing chemicals. She went into great detail regarding her theory of the harvesting and use of such chemicals. I was fascinated by her genius and captivated by her resplendence. She said her father had taught her things that were long forbidden. I asked who her father was, and she waved my question off with a tattooed hand and said enigmatically, "If you were to meet him, it would shatter your very essence." Immediately we came to a small, barren field of dirt. "This," she said proudly, hands on hips, "this is where I will plant my new crop of hybrid wormwood." I folded my arms and nodded, attempting to appear interested in the patch of soil. She walked around the small, freshly plowed field, which was no more than a 50-foot by 50-foot square, and stopped at some type of small machine. After a moment, I realized it was one of those brush chippers that they advertise on cable TV late at night. She snapped her fingers, and instantly the two gunmen, who had to have been at least 50 yards from us, scurried off. She strolled casually over to me, running her tattooed index finger along my chest and whispering the ingredients to her special gold-label absinthe in my ear. Every now and then, kissing my earlobe or nibbling on my neck, she was driving me crazy. I wanted her right there, in the dirt. But I was also afraid of her. Afraid of her power, afraid of her ability to captivate my soul with a mere flick of her tongue. Afraid of the reasons that she had brought me here. Afraid of her snapping her fingers and having her henchmen use their weapons on me. "Who's the tall man that followed us through the forest?" I asked her. She stopped walking around me and stared into my face. Her eyes were not unlike those of the tall man. "You saw him?" "Yes." She simply smiled and then kissed me. As we embraced, sparks fizzled at the edge of my peripheral vision. Everything began swirling, and I thought that I would pass out. She broke our kiss and held me by my shoulders at arm's length. "Good," she said. The men returned. They were escorting another man. I thought I recognized him as one of the other dealers at the tasting table that evening, but I could not be sure. I had not paid close enough attention to my colleagues. He was visibly nervous, yet I sensed a resignation of sorts in him. And he was naked. The two gunmen pushed him to the dirt, and he lay on his back, panting heavily. She walked over to him and straddled him. And she began making love to him. Well, he was quickly aroused and soon moaning with passion. Well, this did not surprise me in the least. What did surprise me was the twinge of jealousy that rose up inside. She seemed to have the ability to invade one's spirit and obliterate all other impressions, even those of self-preserving mortal fear. She moved with the precision of the finest escorts. He bucked and heaved and was obviously about to finish when she stood up, grabbed him by the hair, and held out her open palm toward one of the gunmen, who quickly placed a large knife into her hand. Metal glinted in the moonlight. She slashed once, and then again. His body fell to the earth while she held his severed head by the hair. I'm afraid to believe that I actually saw the severed head look at her and smile. She reached over, switched on the chipper, and tossed the head in. It buzzed and whirred, and then it whined, obviously finished spraying the poor man's head all over her new field. And then she looked at me. She was smiling. "Do not be afraid," she whispered. "I'll not do this to you. I wanted you to see my special soil preparation." The two henchmen slung their rifles over their shoulders and began raking the field very quickly, very vigorously, as if there was an urgency, a need to blend the man's remains into the soil right away. I tilted my head. As if she read my thoughts, she said, "A fascinating and complex organ is the brain. The chemicals it manufactures are most important to this new crop." She walked into the field and began moving some dirt around with her feet and reminded me of her earlier dissertation regarding the brain's chemical manufacturing abilities. Not just endorphins, she continued, but peptides, luteins, protoproteins, adrenaline, serotonin, melatonin, enkephalins, and a dozen other euphoric triggers. These chemicals remain vibrant and active apart from the body, even in soil. But they must be harvested within seconds of being secreted, or the body will use them up. They can be successfully harvested no other way. She looked at her field, which glistened in the hot moonlight, and then snapped her fingers. The two gunmen dragged the body away. She stared into my eyes, and at that moment, if she had asked me to cut off my own head, I would gladly have done so. "They are essential in the production of what will be the finest Artemisia absinthium ever propagated." She then began walking backward to the middle of her barren field. In the midnight haze, her mosaic skin appeared as a myriad of brilliant colors. She was flashing, glowing, sparkling, radiating a life force that I had never experienced before. She curled her index finger at me, beckoning, and lying back on the dirt, she said, "Come." So I went, all the while thinking that although she may kill me while we melded, it was only a dream. And in dreams, which had eluded me for all of my adult life, I could fly. I awoke in the morning with the sun streaming in through my grimy window. My nostrils were clogged with mud, and I was naked and dirty. My room had a shower, so I took one. At breakfast, I counted 19 of us. No one else seemed to notice the missing man. At least I thought someone was missing, but I could not be certain. Our hostess entered in her usual fashion, and we were served a continental breakfast. She didn't eat, but sat there looking at us. Her eyes met mine a few times, but I sensed no message in them. After our plates were cleared, she spoke through her veil, golden eyes glowing. "Today you will tour the Wormwood fields." Then she rose and left the room. We were all sort of sitting there, not certain of what to do next, when in through the same door that the lovely and abstruse Lady Artemisia had just exited, popped a short, spry old man dressed in a white linen suit. And he was smiling. "Gentlemen," he shouted, clapping his petite hands together twice like a Sunday school teacher, "if you will please follow me." He left the room, 19 absinthe dealers in tow. It was funny, but up until the old man had said gentlemen, I had not noticed that we were all men. Not a female absinthe dealer in the bunch. 19. I couldn't help wondering if I had miscounted at the table the night before. The old man showed us around the fields, and they were nothing like what I remembered from the previous night. I was comforted by that. It helped to reinforce my hopes that it was all just a dream. He went on and on about the history of Artemisia absinthium and the effects its primary end product, absinthe, had on the greatest artistic minds of human history, chattering on about how it drove Van Gogh to self-mutilation, probably the most famous case of absinthe-induced dementia, and rattled off a list of well-known creative artists past, with names like Poe, Wilde, Gauguin, Baudelaire, Picasso, and Hemingway, most of whom had descended into various degrees of madness or depression. It seemed strange to me that our tour guide was extolling the negative effects of absinthe upon its users rather than trying to paint a pretty picture. But then again, even I know that addictions pay no mind to history. Then he said it was time to see the new field. We were led through a terribly familiar thicket of trees and across the footbridge of my dream. The brook still babbled. This time I didn't giggle. Instead, a very large pit of fear, anxiety, and dread coalesced in my gut, and I began sweating profusely. I pulled out the handkerchief my mother had given me when I'd left home at 18, intent on seeking my fortune and rediscovering my imagination, and patted my brow. I kept casting sideward glances into the thicket. I strained to hear the buzzing, but all that came to my ears was the constant chattering of the ivory-suited man and the padding of my colleagues' feet on the soft loam. We came to the field of my dream, sans chipper. "This," the old man said, spreading his arms out, "is where our newest hybrid will be grown, and 4 years from now, when the crop is ready, we will produce the finest batch of absinthe the world has ever known." "How so?" one man asked. "Why, my good man," replied our tour guide. He then theatrically cast a conspiratorial look over his shoulder and grinned. "Because this field has been fertilized," he flicked his thin gray eyebrows up and down, "with secret natural elements, the likes of which have never found their way into wormwood root canals in times past. Specifics are naturally a secret, but suffice it to say that," another side eye, "nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever been introduced into the field of agriculture as our Lady Artemisia has prepared for this crop." He threw his shiny head back and laughed. "Trade secrets, my good fellows, trade secrets. Shall we return?" Laughter resonated from amongst the crowd of the other 18, and the old man in the white linen suit smiled. "I will tell you this," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "This crop of wormwood will draw its nutrition from chemicals manufactured by the human brain." His eyes scanned the crowd, gauging a response. Men looked at each other. Murmurs drifted, questions floated up. I felt a wave of nausea pass through me, and I thought for certain that I would throw up and faint where I stood. Thankfully, I maintained my composure. The old man waved at everyone with the back of his hands. "No questions. Come, it's time to place your orders and go." Our mysterious hostess appeared to us only once more before we left. It was after we had all placed our orders and were seated on the lavish bus, a far cry from the midnight pickup truck, that would take us back to the Baldork International Mud Strip down the road. She climbed the stairs into the bus and stood facing us. I was seated in the back and dreadfully brooding over the fact that I had another ride in a twin-engine Cessna coming. I also wondered how on earth we would fit 19 people into such a tiny aircraft. What were we supposed to be, circus clowns? Although she kept her face veiled, her golden eyes flickered above the ginger silk veil that hid her decorated countenance. "Gentlemen," she said, "it has been a pleasure. I hope that we can continue our relationship in such a manner that is beneficial to all." She nodded and turned to leave. Just before she disappeared down the steps, she glanced up and straight into my eyes, and she winked at me. 4 years later, I still wondered whether my dream was actually that, a dream. I told myself that I miscounted that first night, that there really only ever were 19 of us, that the dream of the field was merely a strange gift, a fluke, a freak, that the absinthe had somehow triggered some small portion of the right side of my brain, and that maybe, just maybe, it was beginning to reawaken. Perhaps Danish gold label number 62 was different. If it was only a dream that night in Denmark, then I had cause for rejoicing. And though I spent my days following my first trip to Denmark, reclining poolside and listening to the waves lap the Malibu cliffs, I spent my nights dipping into my new Danish stock in the hopes of more dreams, mingling with the writers and the directors and the painters and the musicians that had been given that extra dose of what had been snatched from me, in the hopes that maybe, now, osmosis would enter the picture. I was actually filled with hope, the hope for the return of my imagination. The desire to create with my mind burned like lightning. Despite the passage of time and the transacting of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of absinthe, and the personal consumption of quite a few 12-ounce bottles of the renowned Danish gold label number 62, I still could not shake the events, or dream events, of that one night in Denmark. If they were real, then I was a material witness to a murder, and therefore had some sort of obligation to tell the authorities. But reason always beat me out of that argument by the simple fact that I was making too damn much money off the Denmark absinthery to shoot myself in the foot. Besides, it's very possible that it was all an absinthe-induced dream or form of psychosis, and so was not to be trusted as having actually occurred. And if it did occur, I strangely felt as if I could not betray her. But when 6 months had passed without a single dream, without one creative thought, despite my consumption of Danish gold label number 62 and my codependent relationships with my clients, my depression returned, stronger than ever. I spent 2 years running through the gamut of newfangled combinations of antidepressants, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Trazodone, blah, blah, blah. My doctor seemed to take great delight in experimenting on me. None of the pills worked, and for a time I was absolutely petrified of getting off them. I had often read of folks that had gone bonkers after stopping their medication, and certainly didn't want to end up on the 6 o'clock news as some crazed gunman that had taken hostages in a standoff at the local Starbucks, and, well, you know how those stories end. Man stops medication, runs amok amidst coffee beans, and kills 23, then self, details at 11. It was 4 years to the day that I received my second invitation to Lady Artemisia's plantation in the hills of Denmark, if I so desired to come. Well, my heart raced at the thought of going there, of meeting her again. The invitation said nothing of the new crop of Wormwood, but I remembered. I packed 5 minutes after receiving the letter. Instead of the twin-engine roller coaster ride from hell, I opted to leave early and took a steamer across the Kattegat Strait. I was much more relaxed when I arrived at the absinthery than I had been on my first visit. As we sat at the long table, I counted 20 of us. This time I recounted and studied faces. Some were actually familiar. She entered with her 2 gunmen. The attendants helped us with our batch of new absinthe, and I must admit that it was the best I had ever tasted, even better than the gold label number 62. Again, I teetered precariously on the blurry brink of bashing my head open on the marble floors of that great absinthery and was escorted to my room. Not by Jeeves, although I saw him across the tasting room, nose in the air, but by a chubby blonde fellow whose name tag read Sven. I called him Jeeves anyway. I fought to stay awake, but I drifted off. I was awakened by the knocking and subsequent entry of the two gunmen. I glanced past them, looking for her, watching for her long, sleek curves, those gorgeous markings all over her body, her sparkling saffron gecko eyes. I was excited. I was afraid. I was absolutely delirious with emotion. But she did not appear. "Strip," Brooklyn said. I did so without question. They escorted me out. Trepidation, anxiety, lust, anticipation, and mortal fear pulsed in my veins. We went through the thicket and over that familiar footbridge. The brook still babbled. I was excited at the thought of going out to meet her, yet my situation seemed more like the one of the poor soul who had lost his head on my previous excursion here. But I could not stop myself. I was afraid, yet I wanted to go. The bushes beside me were dark. I strained to see and feel the entity with the glowing gold eyes, but he was not there. The moon shone down, much as it had all those years ago. My heart raced. I was aroused with anticipation to see her, thrilled at the idea of once again touching her, petrified of what awaited me. Her theories on the brain and its chemicals, supposedly taught to her by her father, rattled around the inside of my head. All other thoughts had been flooded out of my mind. I was frantic at the idea of what my future held. We rounded a turn and went in a different direction than we had 4 years previous, and soon we came upon another barren field. And there she was, like a nebulous fantasy. She was radiant. Her sultry body swayed as she walked around the turbaned man that stood beside her. Off to the side was the chipper. She whispered in his ear, and he giggled. And they saw us, and she came over to me. I was pushed down onto the dirt. My heart pounded in my ears. She looked into my eyes and smiled. And then she was on me, kissing my neck, rubbing against me like a lioness in heat, and we made love. After 4 years, I had never forgotten the feel of her, her smell, her breath, her kisses behind my ear. My mind was ripping apart pieces, screaming, "No, no, this is certain death." And yes, the theory, her theory. She brought me to the point of finishing and then stood up and said, "Quickly, Father." I heard the turbaned man gasp in surprise. I felt a large hand grasp at the top of my head, fingertips digging into my ear canals, and pictured a basketball player palming a ball. I saw her receive the blade that I was both dreading and longing for. She raised her hand. There was no pain, just a blow to my neck, and another. I looked into her golden eyes. She showed no emotion. I was turned to face the tall man that I had seen in the forest years before, and he studied my eye briefly, like a physician with a patient. His own eyes glowed gold. I heard the chipper come on. He removed the patch from my bad eye, and for the first time since that fateful day in my driveway upon my plastic tricycle, I could see out of both eyes. My head was turned to her face, and she studied my eyes as a child would a most peculiar insect, and then I was tossed through the air, and I was blanketed over the earth. I was on the field. I was in the field. I was the field. I osmosed into a multitude of root follicles and became manifold and countless. I came to fruition, and my cilia waved in the night and sang songs of praise to the moon. I was harvested, dried, powdered, distilled, and bottled with others. Ultimately, I have begun to enter the greatest creative minds that this earth has ever known. And I create through them and am immortalized in their creativity.